Hi, this is Debbie, and today I have a review of Prima Watercolor Confections. In particular, I'm looking at the Tropical and Essence palettes. This is part one of a two-part video. In the first video, I'll review the Prima paints, and then in part two, I'll use the paints to watercolor a card. I love to watercolor, and as it's probably my most favourite colouring medium, I enjoy trying out supplies which are new to me. The Prima Watercolor Confections palettes have been around for a while, but this is my first time trying them out, and I wanted to see how they compare to watercolours I currently use. Prima Watercolor Confections are described as artist quality. On first inspection, the palettes are attractively packaged, with the boxes indicating the 12 colours included. Taking a look at the Tropical palette, and inside the box you get the palette, and I have to say this is a very cute size. There is a ring on the back to help steady the palette in your hand if you were using the paints on the go. The palette is designed with areas for mixing. This is the standard design for this type of metal palette. There are two deep mixing wells in the lid of the palette and a flap that folds out that has 4 angled smaller wells, giving a total of 6 wells for mixing, but you can also use the areas around the smaller wells for mixing too. There is a swatch card detailing the numbers of the paints in each row. I think the Tropical palette was one of the earlier releases, and in later releases the swatch card also listed the names of each paint. The 12 paints are beautifully wrapped in half pans. A half pan is the term used for the small plastic cube that the paints are in. Each half pan has a paper wrapper with the number and name of the paint on the reverse. The quality of these palettes is great, and the price point is not unreasonable for the palette alone. In fact, I've heard of people buying the Prima Watercolor Confections just for the palette and filling them with their favourite watercolours. But let's not forget that you are getting 12 watercolours included as well. So let's take a closer look at the paints and how they stack up. I've unwrapped each of the paints and clipped them back into the palette. On the earlier releases of the palette, such as this Tropical one, you may want to make a note of the name of the watercolour on the swatch card before discarding the wrappers. Although the swatch card is included in the box, I actually recommend creating your own on the watercolour card that you usually use. This way you will get a better feel for how the paints will look and behave when you actually come to use them on your project. Before using your paints, it's a good idea to wet them. This helps to activate the pigments in the paint, and you won't have to scrub your brush around to get them started. I use one of 2 ways to wet my paints. I have a small misting bottle filled with water and give the paints a quick squirt, or I use a plastic pipette to add a drop or 2 of water to each colour. One of the key features of watercolours is their translucency, which allows you to layer one colour over another and see the base colour still shining through the layers on top. Not all watercolours are translucent, but it is a feature worth knowing, and the best way to test this is to paint over a black line and then, when dry, see if any of the paint pigment is visible over the top of the line. If a paint is translucent, the black line will look as black as normal, but if not, then the line will appear murky. I created my watercolour swatch using my favourite Archer's cold press watercolour card, mapped out the palette areas, and wrote the name and number of each paint in pencil. I've drawn a thick black line across the areas to be swatched using a waterproof marker. I used a Faber-Castell PITT pen with a broad chisel nib. The paints re-wet easily, and I have to say the colours are lovely and concentrated. I used a strong concentration of paint at the top of each swatch area over the black line to get the best impression of translucency, and then I diluted the concentration as I brought the colour down the swatch. This way you get an idea of what the colour will look like at its most concentrated, mid-value and dilute. I use 2 watercolour containers when watercolouring. You can either use one for warm colours and one for cool colours, or you can wash your brush out in one and then wash it out further in the second. Both methods mean that you are less likely to get muddy colours and give the truest reflection of the colour you are painting. My preferred method is to wash my brush out in the first container and then really make sure it's clean in the second. As you can see, when I'm painting the Tropical palette, at one point I didn't rinse my brush thoroughly enough in the first jar, and the second jar did get a bit murky. I repeated the process to swatch the Essence palette. One point to know is to refrain from painting the swatch next to the one you've just finished and space them out until the first ones are dry, and then you can paint the ones in between. Otherwise, if you painted one swatch right next to its neighbour, then the colours would naturally mix and bleed together. Unlike most artist-grade watercolours, Primas do not detail the pigments used to create the paints, and they don't use traditional names to indicate what pigment might be included either. The names are rather delicious though, and more enticing than the rather dry traditional format. Information on light fastness is also rather hard to come by. Someone painting a picture to hang in a gallery would not likely use these paints without more information. For anyone having fun painting a floral greeting card, I don't see why not. A sketchbook project or greeting card is not likely to get sufficient exposure to light for this to be of concern. As I mentioned, the paints re-wet easily and were highly pigmented, but diluted nicely to give the mid and light values. I will say transparency is an issue for some of the colours. With both swatches painted, let's take a closer look. For the Ponder and Serenity paints and the Essence palette, you can clearly see the pigment showing over the black line. It is one of my bugbears with watercolours when manufacturers try and make pastel colours. I'm not sure how they do it, I'm guessing they have to use more fillers and such, but in my experience the result is not favourable. I find the best way to get a pastel colour is to take a concentrated paint and dilute it, allowing the white of the watercolour paper to create the pastel. So for example, if I wanted to mix a light green, I would take a stronger green and dilute it down until I had the lighter colour I wanted. Back to the palette setup, and the layout allows for 1 or 2 collapsible travel brushes to fit between the rows of paint, which would make this a great watercolour set for on the go. Alternatively, you could create your own mix of favourite colours by using the middle row for more half pans, and I think this would be my preference. I rearranged the colours in one of the palettes, and doing this I was able to fit 21 paints in the cute palette. This left just 3 paints out from the original Tropical and Essence palettes, and I chose to omit 2 of the colours with poor transparency, Ponder and Serenity, and also Earth, which is one of the browns. So my conclusion is that within the palettes there are some really pretty colours. Would I say these are as good or better than, for example, my tubes of watercolour paint such as Daniel Smith? To be honest, I'd say no. However, would I still enjoy using them? Absolutely, and in part 2 of this video I paint a floral watercolour card with these paints and I had a lovely time doing so. In addition, these paints in their pretty palette and contained in half pans are A, more affordable than equivalents in tubes, and B, possibly more approachable to a new or beginner watercolourist. These Prima Watercolor Confections are pretty and fun, with paint which is better than student-grade watercolour, if not perhaps quite as top-notch as some of the more traditional watercolours tube paints. Rather than be daunted by the watercolour world out there, I would much rather someone picked up one of these cute and colourful palettes and actually gave watercolour a try and had fun learning to love this wonderful media. I'll leave links in the YouTube description below to the products that I've used today, as well as a link to the coordinating blog post over at mindutadesign.com and also part 2 of this video. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you'd subscribe to this channel. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.